Thanks everybody for being here. My name is John Roach, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of WholeStory. We're a technology platform that provides insight into life experience to power better hiring. We partner with a number of different workforce development organizations to help job seekers better be able to tell their stories, their whole stories, in the interview process. And we also work with social service organizations and other employers to help them fill job openings in a more inclusive and equitable way. And a few years ago, when we started this work, we were acutely aware of what sometimes is referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. So this is the aggregate impacts of automation, artificial intelligence, remote working, the Internet of Things that are radically reshaping the workforce. Those factors are leading towards an elevated awareness of the need for more collaborative, emotionally intelligent, empathetic workforce that knows how to come together and work, right? So we've been carrying that awareness for some time. And then, of course, in the last 9 months, we've seen these twin impacts of first the pandemic, and then shortly following, a reawakening and a re-engagement with this absolutely crucial conversation around racial and economic justice that was prompted by a summer of protests and then the ensuing conversation after that. And so we have these three major forces, this fourth industrial revolution, the conversation around racial and economic justice, and the realities of a post-pandemic environment that we are all in. And these three things together are really contributing and creating what we see as the biggest transformation to the labor market and the future of work in a century. And so that's a big, tall order that everybody in this space is tasked with trying to grasp and understand and apply to their work. And in the day-to-day that we are all faced with just taking care of business, many of us with also kids at home. I have 2 elementary school kids remote learning at home right now as we speak. And, you know, it can be hard to sort of pull back out of that day-to-day and take a minute to grapple with both the challenges and the opportunities that exist in this moment that we're in. And so I am extremely grateful to our panelists today who come from a wide variety of backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, but all with different expertise on how these forces are coming together and interacting and shaping where we're headed. And then finally, I would like to introduce my co-founder and my friend who will be moderating today's discussion. He is our head of business and partnership development, and his name is Darren Varnado. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Darren.
Hi, I'm Darren, and I'll be your moderator for today. Today's discussion is broken into 3 parts. Part 1, understanding the problem. Part 2, exploring the possibilities. And 3, identifying the challenges and opportunities. Thank you all so much for joining us today. With that said, let's get to it. I'd like to begin by having each panelist to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work. Why don't we start with you, Fred?
I'm Fred Krug. I'm the managing director, or one of the managing directors at Europe nationally. I'm located in Seattle. I've been with the organization for nearly 10 years. I was the executive director in Europe Puget Sound. I've been doing work to help 18 to 24-year-old young adults move into adulthood, into a successful adulthood, specifically in career and education paths for the past 25 years. So that's kind of my background attached to this. I'm pleased to be here, and it's a pleasure to be on such a great, amazing panel of people. So thank you for inviting me.
My name is Samara Thomas. Recently, I shifted my work to supporting the foundational equity training program for a local government organization that delivers community and human services. And so that's been the focus of my work in this most recent period of racial unrest.
I'm Carol Lewali. I'm the Associate Director of External Relations at Seattle University's Career Engagement Office. My role in higher education is really, I say it's a fancy way of saying employer relations. So I work with those employer partners and external organizations who are seeking to hire our students and places our students want to have some experiential learning opportunities. I'm happy to be here.
My name is Gabriela Fajardo. I am a senior portfolio manager with REDF. REDF is a national venture philanthropy organization focused on providing advisory support and funding to what we call employment social enterprises. And so we provide advisory support as well as funding to those organizations so that they can grow and ultimately employ more individuals.
So I'm Ryan Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Seattle Jobs Initiative, and we are a workforce intermediary. We're based in Seattle, but we do have a national reach as well. We're a small but mighty organization, but really in deep and partnering and connected with a lot of different players in the workforce space.
The short answer is yes and yes, right? We're seeing an impact from historic inequities related to access to education and job training opportunities. We certainly know that historically, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are overrepresented in the service industries. And in current years, we've seen a trend where those industry roles are becoming part-time and uninsured, part of this sort of gig work that's part of the fourth industrial revolution, right? Just across a number of different systems, COVID is illuminating gaps and cracks in the system that have existed, inequities that have existed for generations. We know in the workforce that there's been historic inequities in access to senior leadership. The organizations that have white-capped mountains where maybe over the years they've done a lot of effort to diversify their workforce, and they're seeing that in, administrative positions and maybe some finance positions, certainly direct service roles, but the higher and higher you get into the organization, the fewer and fewer people of color that you see on the employment roles. And so that's certainly being an issue that's being illuminated here as we see disparities in who has access to remote work opportunities and things like that. And then certainly we're seeing access to affordable healthcare affecting who's able to remain in the workforce. Many people, and overwhelmingly women, are leaving the workforce temporarily to be able to homeschool their children as, the school year started online and at home across most of the country. So all of those are sort of compounding challenges that we're seeing exacerbated. And then we're also seeing, some fundamentally new elements, and certainly I'm interested to see what the impact is on the employment landscape as companies move to permanent remote work, as that's certainly going to reshape the service industries, retail industries, travel industries, and more. So I'm excited to see what opportunities arise.
Essentially, three things happened during this pandemic. Either you were laid off, you were a frontline worker, essential worker, being kind of more exposed, or you were able to work from home. And I think as these months pass on, as these years move forward and we're moving to more and more remote work, I fear that this kind of divide that we're currently seeing now is just going to be that much more exacerbated. And we're going to particularly see Black and brown folk impacted by this, by health outcomes, by employment outcomes, by stress levels that they're facing. And therefore, I think the work that we do and what we're doing right now is even all the more important. And having these conversations right now to ideally kind of nip this in the bud before it gets even worse.
So yeah, I think it's yes and yes as well. So we definitely saw some exacerbation of existing things. The analogy that I would say is, even though my accent doesn't show it, I grew up in Oklahoma, And when I was in high school, people would get these trucks and they would have these awesome, powerful engines in them, but the bodies were held together literally with duct tape and baling wire. And I feel that kind of describes our labor market before COVID. We had this economic engine under the hood that was powering going forward, but the brakes, the suspension, the tires were all really suspect. And that's the workforce and those equities within the economy. What COVID and then the Black Lives Matter movement has done is taken that truck going 40 miles an hour down a pothole filled road. And so now pieces are flying off in different directions. So I think what we're seeing, those frontline jobs that have adversely impacted communities of color and women in the workforce in particular, the one thing that I would add is that it's going to exacerbate the ability to get a first job going forward. So what do I mean by the first job? That's that job that maybe when we're in high school or we're in college, that we're getting that entry-level job. And so now those jobs are going to be done by people just trying to meet basic needs. And then second, confounding that is that those jobs are now being automated. So we're finding that those jobs are going to start to go away and become more scarce. So how does someone, particularly that lacks social capital or doesn't have that prestigious degree from a university, able to enter the workforce with those barriers? That first job provides incredibly valuable skills. On the flip side, the one other thing that we found in our research about that nexus between COVID and what we're calling the network economy or that fourth industrial revolution is that soft skills are the new hard skills. So those in-demand skills are going to be those things that you actually learn from that first job. How do you work with other people? How do you build your EQ? How do you develop those critical thinking skills? Technical skills are still important, but what's going to set people apart for that next economy is the ability to marry those together. But unfortunately, our system is going to continue to exacerbate and put additional barriers into those populations that have already faced an uphill battle. That hill just got a lot steeper.
Right now, the pandemic is shaping so much. We're seeing things like internships being rescinded, or even that first job offer being rescinded or modified in some way. And we're also seeing not only college students or recent graduates competing for that entry-level job, but we're also seeing even those who are more seasoned professionals, sort of with the new sort of fourth industrial revolution, they're also having concerns like, am I even qualified enough? I may have to go for this entry-level job to stay competitive. I'm not sure if my skills are there where the tech work is. And so we're seeing a competition for those jobs from both seasoned workers and those who are sort of entering into the workplace. So this pandemic, yes, it has absolutely highlighted everything that's out there, and it is also reshaping what the future of work will be.
In this time of crisis, when you see a lot of people exiting the workforce, there's some things that happened in even the 2007, 2009 economic kind of downfall that sort of are mimicking, but they're also getting exacerbated. And the one that's, I think, I would say if you're going to highlight anything, Black women not going back or dropping out of the workforce is the space where I think from a policy standpoint, we should be spending the most energy. We have 8% reduction in community college enrollment, right? So that's an impact space. You've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 865,000 women dropping out of the American workforce, right? So you have this sort of shed that's getting caused by economics, right? Both on the education side that you mentioned, right? So people having to be home, women seeming to be more of the provider that goes and makes that choice. Then you have a lack of engagement on the educational side. And then on the other side, which is the employment side, which I share this because I try to simplify it, right? Because there's a lot of urgency here. But I think what we have to do is be really crystal clear on the messaging that we're providing to employers. Employers in the history of 2007, 2009 started doing an upskilling trend, and they created a space that was is modified by what's like a beverage curve. And it shows like what's the active workforce looking, and then what are the actual skills. And they jack the skills up, they push them higher. And if we don't address that conversation at the employment level to talk about using this window as an opportunity to diversify your workforce instead of basically shutting your workforce down, with this idea that if I'm sitting there and I have thousands to pick from, I can actually choose an upskilled version of that. Not as many people have the ability to get that upskilled version, and it has the impact that it has on communities of color. It actually creates such a chasm that you're actually going to de-diversify the workforce, and all the work that we've been doing to get that first leg into a job and diversifying even that front end, which is not the success rate that we're searching for. We're talking about you talked about the mountain cops, right? The caps. We're trying to push that trend all the way through. We got some legs, at least on a partial space in the past 15, 20 years. And that all can deteriorate rapidly without a really clear view of what we need to do with employers. So I've been talking to HR teams about this. Like, look, please understand what this means when you're assessing talent. What does it mean to look at pre-baccalaureate talent versus putting 4-year degrees and continue to amplify that? So we've done a lot of work as an organization to talk about what it means to be dismissed by degrees. And we have some articles that Harvard Business School has done around this as well. So I kind of implore our employer base to say, look, please spend some energy and time before you make decisions that will literally set your workforce development and diversity back 15 to 20 years. And I think that's the imperative, right? I think there's an urgency from social to protect individuals in the space and make sure that we're doing interventions. But there is this other place that if that landing spot is not correct, you will literally wipe out all of the progress that's been made by amazing groups that are sitting on this around this table right now. I don't know if that's too preachy, but I would just say, like, please, we have to be aware what is happening to, like, honestly, what's happening to Black women in the United States right now in this space and time. It is a critical juncture, and we can't ignore it or pretend it's just some wash across all. That is a very pointed space, and I say it with passion because I think it's important.
Well, and can I just add that that's a trend that started before COVID. So, you know, in the tech industry from 2007 to 2017, during a time when companies were publicly stating a commitment to diversifying their workforce, simultaneously, there was actually a loss of the number of Black women in the tech industry. And there's a reason for that, right? There is a connection here around retention and corporate culture. So I just want to highlight that this is exacerbated again by COVID, but it is a trend that's existed.
To add to something as well, especially the women's aspect and Black women aspect of this conversation, what we're seeing is now the pandemic has sent people home, and guess what happened? Not only are we working our regular jobs from home, but we're also now taking on the caregiving that is at home, that's creating sort of this second job that's happening. Whether it's caregiving for school-age children or maybe an ailing parent, you know, we're sort of that sandwich generation. So thinking about those folks as well, and that burden that's created with that, as well as the pandemic with the racial inequities showing up, there's now almost this burden for Black women to be also educating companies, the communities, their workspaces on what it is to be socially just or creating equity. And so it's almost like they're working 3 full-time jobs, yet not getting any additional pay, not getting any additional flexibility. Nothing is being added to their plate in terms of compensation that will make this even remotely better. So they are most likely the ones to be dropping out of the workplace. I totally agree with what Fred was saying. That is an alarming number and rate to be watching, and we should be paying attention to that. We're seeing what we call micro internships. So as opposed to sort of a year-long internship or a summer internship, so maybe half of that time period. And that's a great way for especially students or people looking for some work in between jobs could be staying engaged in the workforce. The other thing I would encourage is the workforce or employers should be looking at not strictly just the internship, but thinking about how are people gaining the skills out there already? Because we already know not everyone can afford an internship. Internship is actually an elite experience because cost of higher education is super high. And so people are working lots of jobs. So you could still be in a service industry, but learning some skills that the soft skills, the transferable skills that companies want so much, and how those could be still a good experience for someone to take into a professional career.
Employers that understand how to lead with compassion, with flexibility and really look at the human element on this are doing well. Some of them that are struggling they have a fixed kind of model or mindset, and it's harder to adjust, right? And that's where you wind up with these like internships that don't fit. We can't do that right now. And I think it's because some of them are in survival mode. I'm seeing a lot of companies that are just saying that we need to retain our talent the way it is. And that makes it really hard for detached from workforce finding access. I think they've expanded the way they even look at location-based talent and expanded that parameter to be talent from anywhere. There are pros and cons to that, right? If you're active in a specific locale, right? I mean, it's a more competitive landscape for different jobs then. And there are some things there that are, just like I would talk about with Black women, there are some things that this really is important for us to be looking at. What does that mean when you have a hub in a local market, but the competition now can be global, right? And that is interesting. It's just become something we need to be very aware of as we're working in a community that we're in, especially if that's the focus.
We're working with employers, and these employers that we're working with, they basically have a mission and have had a mission to employ individuals that are generally on the fringe of the labor force anyways, where traditional employers don't want to hire. And so the employment social enterprises that we work with are hiring those individuals. And kind of what we're seeing right now is because of their mission, they are not necessarily thinking about their bottom line. They're obviously trying to stay afloat, but their like core part is like, how do I retain and how do I keep the individuals that we know there's nowhere else for them to go? And so we're seeing a lot of our kind of businesses, organizations are basically pivoting business models. And so there are some really kind of like creative ways that some employers that have some sort of mission are thinking about not only their bottom line, but they're also thinking about what are the ways that I can like support the folks that are employing. They're cutting their salaries themselves and they're going without salary in order to keep their participants and employers employed or in programming. We're also seeing organizations that feel ethically that they don't feel right putting their employees out in the workforce being exposed. And so they're figuring out creative ways to keep them in-house, getting them trained up through virtual programming so that when we do hopefully get out of this, folks are that much more prepared for this new workforce that we're entering. And
let's maintain what we have rather than looking out to new employees is sort of the harm minimization that a lot of organizations are really focused on right now. We know that compounding barriers to employment will make it that much more difficult down the road for those folks to re-enter the workforce. And so I'm thinking about things like, we have this looming housing crisis, eviction crisis. We know that housing is one of the critical elements that folks need to be successful as they're in the workforce.
I'll put a positive light. So SJ, we work closely with the Healthcare Industry Leadership Table, which is a collaboration here in King County of over 50 different healthcare employers. And rather than take the tack of, oh my goodness, we have this huge labor market we can pick and choose from, instead the leaders of that organization have said, no, we need to take this moment to really become an anti-racist employer. And what does that mean? And recognizing that it's not a short-term fix, it's not just the change in a policy, but it's a journey for their entire organizations. So we have folks around that table that are competing for patients, that are competing for healthcare insurance contracts, but on workforce, they come together to collaborate. That's the way that sector strategies, particularly in regions, are going to be able to meaningfully be able to move the needle and provide opportunities for those communities that have been marginalized. The barriers there are childcare. That is the number one barrier that individuals are facing with online school and children at home. Parents are having to make a choice. Who's going to move to part-time? Who's going to have to give up their job? Particularly for families that are working in frontline jobs, remote work is not an option. So you can't be on a Zoom call and then trying to provide care and not to mention guidance around school as well. I think waiting for school to go back to normal is something that we can't do, and we need to be looking at policies that can support working parents with children at home that are engaged in school.
I think first we have to let go of this idea of going back. Let's start with that. What are some of the things we need to be letting go of right now? And what is worth keeping that we should go back to if we needed to? What we have to imagine now, again, is new policies and new ideas and ways of doing business completely. So going back to school, we have to reimagine what school might be like. We might want to consider truly flexible working hours. So school may not return to the way we imagined it to be. Smaller classrooms, we've talked about it for decades, but now we really need them.
What's happened with both in the remote workspace and also for individuals who have other demands on their lives, like working from home, there is such as like a socioeconomic divide that occurs so rapidly. I have a young adult who has to work in a home with 3 other people with bandwidth that doesn't work, trying to do an internship. The bandwidth that exists, the room that they're in, the space that they have, all take pressures and put them on. So all of those things that we used to mitigate by saying, look, you can go to a large company, you have an office, it looks the same as everyone else's office, it works this way. You could remove yourself. And even when we were doing education in person, you could remove yourself from a home space and you had more of a level playing field. We do not have a policy set at the current moment that says we can level your playing field for work equity. 5 years from now, without access, if I don't have a strategy for it in the immediate, what does that mean for this generation of workforce that is 19, 20, 25, like whatever that is? This is an immediacy. There's some data that if you get detached from the workforce, even if you get a job back in, even 5 years later, you're still 14% behind in wages, even in a 5-year layer. That was done in Washington State in the 2007 to 2009 recession. If that data holds true or is even worse because of where we are right now, you don't make that up. I think it's important that we as communities, and this is government, right, saying we need to have a true, clear, pointed intervention. And it may not help everybody, but it needs to address some very specific things.
What we're seeing is some organizations have taken it upon themselves to provide hazard pay. And I think that's a policy that we're missing at the national level at this point. But again, that's another policy at the policy level that we need to be thinking about. As I've mentioned, that they're thinking of pulling folks off the front line and saying, how do we use this time creatively, doing some sort of internal internships for folks. So those are a kind of couple of ways that we're seeing organizations adjust a bit into thinking about, how do I internally think about new policies when we're not getting like the lack of support that's coming from a state or a national level.
One of the trends that I'm really aware of that directly impacts equity in the workplace right now is related, again, to this remote work shift and a loss of community organizing power. So one of the challenges with remote work is that a lot of our interactions day to day take place because we happen to be in the same space with someone. And that's how we start to identify trends as opposed to one individual's experience, right? So it really obfuscates the inequities and makes it easier for management who aren't necessarily in tune with their staff to minimize the experiences, particularly of staff of color, rather than seeing kind of a global view of that.
What we are hearing is this uncertainty from the philanthropic community. A lot of our nonprofits are telling us, look, I don't know where our funder stands at this point. So I get and I understand the urgency to address the pandemic as well as the racial inequities that we believe that we're doing in our work. However, we're seeing the philanthropic community seems to make this like complete shift in another direction. And so they're scared. And all we say, like, this, it's great that more funding is going to some really critical challenges and issues that have been plaguing us for generations and centuries. Where is where that we need to put a clear stake in the ground to provide some sort of level of stability for the groups that we support so that they know how to plan for the future when everything else seems to be falling apart.
The public investment, particularly from those local partners, counties, cities, and states, are exceptionally financially stressed. In Washington State, the good news is that our state projected deficit fell from $9 billion to $4.5 billion. That's billion with a B. That's going to have a downstream effect on funding all these organizations. So if I had a message for philanthropy, it would be this: put out money to those organizations that you partner with for a long time for general operating funds. Keep these organizations afloat and allowing them to be able to navigate through these unknown waters. But putting those restrictions on has the potential to backfire, and we could lose some organizations that represent communities and voices that need to be represented, and not just represented, but amplified.
I think the question is really, what are they going to put as point impacts on those resources, including for their own individual corporations, right? I mean, the investment question that becomes is, what is the systemic shift, right? And I think that's the question that's not fully baked yet, right? I don't think we know. I think there are a lot of people trying to figure this out. Am I making an investment to bridge something for 6 months? Or am I making an investment for systemic change because this opportunity is open? And if it's systemic change, what am I actually investing in? And what is the accountability point on that? I'm not certain everyone's clear yet, right? I think we're in a mixed bag, right? I think everyone's sort of waiting because they don't know if they're investing for a year or are they investing for 20 years, right? And what am I investing in? There's some good work, right? Like I said, there are good investments out there, right? Some of them are back to the same players. I'm not certain that it's going to change the systemic impact they want. There are some philanthropists that are making heavy investments, but they want to do things a certain way. And they're going into communities that already have some infrastructures, and they're not investing in those infrastructures, and especially communities of color. And that is a really interesting dynamic that's playing out, which is like, we want to do something, but we want to do it this way, as opposed to going into the community and asking the question, like, what do you really need and who's doing it? And could they do it better if we did something different?
Fred, preach, like you're spot on, right? Funding is great, it's important, but where is that funding being invested? Are we listening to the communities that are most impacted to not only determine where to invest those dollars, but also what does an outcome actually look like, right? What are we measuring here? And we should not be using white dominant culture to determine success outcomes for communities of color, right? Like Fred, I think I'm just building on the points you made about like systemic investment here, right? Like we have an opportunity to actually change the way this country has operated for 400 years. This is our time. Our time is now. We can do this because people are interested in doing it, right? But if it's performative and then the companies that are investing want to drive what that investment looks like, then we're simply perpetuating the inequities that have existed. We need to have a paradigm shift here and actually listen to communities of color about what their needs are and how they want their success measured, and invest appropriately to drive that.
Even some organizations have even withdrawn funding to nonprofits who have really been at the forefront of anti-racism work. The intolerance of discomfort with organizations is actually giving people a lot of pause on what or how far they want to commit to all these commitments that they've been making. So yes, in essence, it's turning out to be performative. Boards of organizations are beginning to look at their board makeup, both for nonprofit, and this is so key with nonprofits as well. Like, who's on your board? Are you having community members on your board that representing the interests of the communities? And the same thing with corporate boards as well. We need to be having corporate boards that have representation, Black, Indigenous, and people of color on those boards. But when we see all white boards making all white decisions, this is not going anywhere.
I'll circle back to something that Ryan said on the first question. Soft skills are the new hard skills. We really need to focus on helping folks leverage the skills that they gain both inside and outside of the workforce to be able to help companies be more successful, right?
I think listening to young adults' experience, I would tell you two things. You need to make sure that in transition, whether it's transition from a sector to another sector or into a new sector, creating a mentorship for people as they bridge, somebody that understands the system and can guide them through it is really critical. And also, you can see it in companies with ERGs, right? There are communities of color that kind of get together and kind of focus groups. I think they need to be done in more of a microcosm, right? In a smaller way, like we do with our learning communities, that we need to be providing that for people as they transition so that the landing place makes sense. And connecting to the idea that you need these skills about the workplace, but you're going to be switching jobs. You're going to be switching classifications in different places you're working. So you need a landing place that's supportive so they can be most effective as rapidly as possible. And I think those two things of mentorship and small communities working together to share that skill and support are really critical in that transition.
Another key takeaway would be transferable skills. You know, when we talk about, say, veterans, they really had a specific particular skills that they learned, but how we transferring those, and programs that work with veterans know very well how to do that. So thinking of transferable skills from industry, from any particular background, like I said, you could be working in any particular job, entry-level job, and you're still earning a skill that you could take to, say, a professional job. Also want to share that mentoring is only just not for youth or young adults. Mentoring is at any age range, and it can be also reversed. You don't have to be a seasoned professional to even receive mentorship or advice from someone entering a job market. And even mentorships don't have to be full, long-term structured things. Flash mentorship is key, particularly in building things like networks, which will be the entryway to jobs globally.
One of the things that we learned from veterans is building social capital networks. So I think that's a great place that all of us on this panel can help, is breaking down social capital barriers, whether that's for an entry-level job on a career pathway or for somebody transitioning over. You know, I'm a veteran myself, and I'm always willing to open the door for somebody else with that shared experience. So how can we do that for returning citizens? How can we do that for immigrant refugee communities? How can we do that for our women of color? That's probably the number one barrier that we can break down to open up those opportunities.
One more thing to add, I think we just need to think about in terms of programs that not every population is created the same. And so we need to design our programs and design our employers need to think about their individuals that they're hiring, individuals that we're serving through our programs, and think of them as customers and design our programs as they are customers and users. At the employer level, I think we shouldn't expect someone to get up going on the first day of job. Like, employers, I think, need to step up and provide more supportive services, more employment resources for individuals to be successful at the job, and partner with organizations in order to do that.
We know that students who don't have access to the internet basically don't have access to their education right now. We know that for workers, finding and maintaining an income today is only possible with internet access. And the places that some folks used to gain their internet access, like the library system, are not really accessible. And we also know that for folks who live in domestic violence situations, the internet access is absolutely vital to their safety, because abuse and violence thrive in isolation. And so this is super, super critical right now. And I've seen a lot of community organizing around Wi-Fi as a lifeline and getting Wi-Fi access into the hands of our community.
Thinking about what we need around distribution and how do you identify that, that's kind of the critical space. I think there's a lot of good community organizing happening, and there's a lot of like quick solves, but there's not a ongoing, like, really good solid base to hold that infrastructure together. And it's really fragile. Ryan had mentioned the trucks with the duct tape, and I would say it's kind of the same thing right now, right? We can get some stuff out, but we don't have a good plan going forward, and because they don't know how long that's going to be. And I think people are hesitant to spend the infrastructure money when you don't know what the end date is, right? And I think that's where this weird rub is.
I think what we've seen that be successful is using social media as a way of delivering programming and like bringing people together. So Instagram Lives, Facebook Lives have been ways that we've seen organizations kind of be able to provide program aside from providing, purchasing data for folks, providing Wi-Fi spots, providing actual smartphones. just being really creative on how leveraging social media.
I'm seeing employers that literally mailing things out. So let's say it's an onboarding package. It's maybe like a flash drive that's pre-recorded and they can watch, something that's downloadable. So usage of other media types. Manual delivery of books is now even happening, or centralized delivery. Again, a lot of creativity, and yes, lots of duct tape ways of putting it together. But we should be saying, are we future ready? And the future is here. I think we've been asking about it, but we have never really, it was literally almost like flipping a light switch on to have to pivot.
Digital literacy skills are going to be required in almost every job that you are doing. So every on-ramp program that we're designing includes digital literacy assessments. It includes digital literacy skills. Getting somebody in a laptop in a hotspot, if they don't have the capacity to leverage that and put that to use, doesn't really solve the problem. It's part of the solution. It is necessary, but not sufficient. So adding that digital literacy onto those, what's already been said, is really critical to adapting for the future.
Looking at new funding sources like philanthropy, working with philanthropy that shares your values, and looking for organizations and funders that are transparent with their processes and trying to apply in that way. Partnership, I think, is critical. So, working with your local organizations and leveraging each other's strengths and be able to figure out creative ways of how to partner and how to serve more individuals, I think is a critical way in us. And policy advocacy, getting on the ground, calling your local representatives, being out on the street, demanding more support, I think is really critical if we're going to kind of see some change and bring more money down to these groups.
Collaboration, coordination, sharing of resources, integrating more. We need to stop sort of acting like in silos, and maybe even coming together as coalitions with similar interests, and maybe even serving people together. And that will even bring new ideas of thinking about this problem, and with integrating new solutions into it, instead of seeing each other as competitors. I'm seeing that in my own industry. This time we've collaborated more with my colleagues in other institutions more than ever before. And it has not taken away anything. In fact, it's added so much value to what we're already doing with the resources that we have.
Through the route of innovation and collaboration is how you get through times where there's not enough money, right? So I think the only thing I would recommend is that from a funding standpoint, you need to go collectively to the funders, because the request is going to have to be that there's some flexibility and unification of funding around some specific topics. And I think at this point, when you can highlight there's a huge gap from wherever's funding stream, to go back unified as a group of providers and say, we need this from you without us nitpicking at it, is something that's really important. And I think that needs to be organized across all spectrums. We can't just do it from specific services. We actually have to go collectively as a humanitarian effort, honestly, and say, we need to help our community. We need funders to infuse this space, and we need to figure out how to do it better. I think that's going to be the trick.
I just think that there's a real opportunity for government to codify some of this. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014 is currently up for
Authorization.
Reauthorization. And so I think there's an opportunity within the federal legislation to actually push for public-private partnership and alignment of funding, and really what we're asking for providers to be delivering.
There is no other entity aside from the federal government that can fill the whole of what we're looking at. All of these ideas are fantastic. They're things that we should do. As Samara said, this is our moment. Those things are absolutely true. But we're talking about a whole that is multiple $1 trillion when you take into account unemployment benefit, housing assistance, food benefits. All of those require federal investment. They're going to require that federal commitment to that recovery. And we need to stand ready to add value to that, but without those fundamental cornerstones to be able to continue to stabilize and then drive an inclusive and equitable recovery, it's going to be really hard to fill that deficit. So consumer demand, for example, is down $1 trillion, right? T, like $1 trillion, and even B, billions coming from philanthropy are not going to come close to being able to fill that hole. And that's really what's essential. So it is our time to innovate. It is our time to lead. It is our time to drive what those investments look like, but make no bones about it. We need that federal investment or we're going to be in a really, really long tail.